You don't belong in first class. People like you make real passengers uncomfortable, and I won't have us contaminating my VIP cabin.
The words sliced through the premium cabin of American Elite Airways Flight 847 like a blade through silk. Every conversation stopped, every head turned. The only sounds were the low hum of the auxiliary power unit and the sudden collective intake of breath from 43 passengers who couldn't believe what they'd just heard. Captain Derek Thompson stood over seat 1A. His chest puffed out, his silver-streaked hair perfectly styled, and his jaw set in a line of absolute certainty. At 45, Derek looked every inch the elite pilot he believed himself to be. His uniform was pressed to military precision, his captain's wings gleaming under the cabin lights, and his voice carried the authority of 18 years commanding aircraft worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But the man he was addressing didn't flinch. Jerome Williams, 42 years old, sat calmly in seat 1A, wearing a charcoal gray hoodie and comfortable dark jeans. His broad shoulders filled the luxury seat naturally, and his deep brown eyes held a stillness that most people mistook for submission. They were wrong. Jerome's calm came from a different place entirely. The quiet confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he was capable of. "Excuse me." Jerome's voice was steady, controlled, with just the slightest edge that suggested Derek had made a serious miscalculation. Derek's lip curled into a sneer. "You heard me. This is first class, premium passengers only. Your ticket must be a mistake or worse." He gestured dismissively at Jerome's casual attire. "Look at you, hoodie jeans, that bag that looks like it came from a thrift store. My VIP passengers paid $8,000 for this experience, and I won't have it degraded by someone who clearly doesn't understand what belongs where." From seat 3B. Brandon Miller, a 28-year-old tech executive, had already pulled out his phone. His fingers flew across the screen as he started a live stream. "This is happening right now on American Elite Airways Flight 847, he whispered into his device. A pilot is literally telling a passenger he doesn't belong in first class because of how he's dressed. The cabin was split level with first class elevated above the main passenger area. From her jump seat near the galley flight attendant, Carmen Rodriguez watched the scene unfold with growing horror. At 34, Carmen had seen Derek Thompson's behavior before, but never quite this blatant, never quite this public. Her olive-skinned hands gripped the edge of her seat as she tried to decide whether to intervene. "Captain Thompson," Jerome said quietly, and Derek's eyes narrowed at hearing his name. "I have a valid boarding pass, a confirmed reservation, and I've paid for this seat in full. I haven't caused any disturbance, raised my voice, or bothered anyone. What exactly is your complaint?" Derek laughed, a harsh sound that carried no warmth. "My complaint? Look around this cabin." He gestured broadly at the other first-class passengers. "Do you see anyone else dressed like they just rolled out of bed? Do you see anyone else who looks like they wandered onto the wrong aircraft?" Senator Isabella Rodriguez, seated in 2A across the aisle, lowered her tablet and stared at Derek with undisguised disgust. The 52-year-old legislator had heard discrimination before, but rarely so openly displayed. Behind her business executive, Jennifer Walsh, had started recording on her phone, her corporate instincts telling her this was about to become a very big story. "Before we dive deeper into what's happening here," Brandon said to his growing live stream audience, "let me ask you something. Drop your location in the comments and tell me, have you ever been told you don't belong somewhere just because of how you look? Because what's about to happen next will shock you. And if you believe in treating people with basic human dignity, you need to hit that subscribe button right now." Jerome reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out a small leather notebook. With deliberate precision, he clicked a pen and began writing. Derek watched this action with growing irritation. "What are you doing?" Derek demanded. "Taking notes," Jerome replied without looking up. "Time, date, flight number, your name, exact quotes. Please continue with what you were saying about people who look like me." Derek's face flushed red. "Don't try to turn this into something it's not. This is about standards. This is about maintaining the premium experience my airline promises. You're disrupting that experience just by being here. I'm sitting quietly in a seat I paid for," Jerome said, still writing. The only disruption in this cabin is coming from you. Carmen finally found her voice. Captain Thompson, sir, I've checked Mr. Williams's boarding pass and identification. Everything is in order. He has platinum status with our airline. Derek whipped around to face her. Oh, platinum status can be faked, Carmen. Credit cards can be stolen. Look at him. Really look. Does he strike you as someone who legitimately belongs in a seat that costs $8,000? The racism in Derek's words hung in the air like smoke. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. An elderly Korean-American couple, Robert and Helen Kim, whispered to each other in obvious distress. From his live stream, Brandon's voice carried across the cabin, "Did everyone just hear that this pilot is literally profiling a passenger based on his race and appearance?" Jerome closed his notebook and looked up at Derek with those calm, steady eyes. "Captain Thompson, you're making a very serious mistake right now." Derek laughed again. "Am I? I'm the captain of this aircraft. At 35,000 feet, my word is law. And I'm telling you that you don't belong here. There's been an obvious error, and I'm correcting it." "No error," Jerome said quietly. "Just a captain who's about to learn that there are consequences for treating passengers like this." The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut. 43 passengers, one flight crew, and thousands of people watching Brandon's live stream were about to witness something that would change everything. Derek Thompson thought he was exercising his authority as captain. He had no idea he was staring at the one man in America who could end his flying career with a single phone call. But that revelation was still minutes away. For now, Derek stood in his perfectly pressed uniform, completely confident in his power, utterly certain of his righteousness, and absolutely convinced that the quiet man in seat 1A was someone he could intimidate into compliance. He was wrong on every count. To understand how this moment came to pass, you have to understand the two men facing each other in that first-class cabin and how their very different paths through life had led them to this point. Derek Thompson was born into aviation royalty. His grandfather, Colonel James Thompson, had flown P-51 Mustangs over Europe during World War II, earning 3 distinguished flying crosses and becoming a legend in the family. His father, Captain Michael Thompson, had transitioned from military service to become one of Pan American's most decorated pilots, flying the glamorous international routes during the golden age of air travel. Derek grew up in a world where aviation was nobility, where pilots were kings of the sky, and where the cockpit represented the pinnacle of American achievement. He attended the prestigious Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, on a legacy scholarship, graduated at the top of his class, and was recruited by American Elite Airways straight out of college. For 18 years, he'd built his career on the foundation of his family name and his own considerable flying skills. But somewhere along the way, Derek had confused his authority as a pilot with a broader authority over people. The cockpit had become his kingdom, and he'd appointed himself judge of who belonged in his realm. His personnel file, buried deep in American Elite's databases, contained 17 complaints over the past 5 years. Complaints about passengers being questioned unnecessarily about random additional security checks that seemed to target people of color, about comments that towed the line between inappropriate and illegal. The airline had handled these complaints quietly, reassigning Derek to different routes when things got too heated, offering modest compensation to aggrieved passengers in exchange for their silence. They valued Derek's flying skills and his family's legacy with the company. Besides, he'd never done anything quite egregious enough to justify the paperwork nightmare of terminating a senior captain. That was about to change. Jerome Williams had taken a very different path to this moment. Born in Detroit to a family where aviation was a dream, deferred not a birthright, Jerome had grown up hearing stories about his grandfather, Master Sergeant William Wings Williams. Wings had been a Tuskegee Airman, one of the first African-American military pilots, but when the war ended and he applied to commercial airlines, every door slammed shut. Not ready for colored pilots, they'd said. Passengers wouldn't feel safe, they'd explained. Wings ended up working as an aircraft mechanic for 40 years, maintaining the planes he should have been flying. He'd passed that love of aviation to his son Jerome's father, who became an air traffic controller. And he'd passed it to Jerome, who'd grown up with airplane models covering his bedroom walls, and a burning desire to not just work in aviation, but to change it. Jerome started as an aircraft mechanic himself, working night shifts to put himself through college. He earned his degree in aeronautical engineering, then his pilot's license, then his law degree. He'd spent 15 years climbing through the Federal Aviation Administration, from inspector to regional director to his current position as director of field operations. At 42, Jerome Williams had more authority over American aviation than any other single person except the FAA administrator himself. But Jerome didn't exercise that authority from behind a desk in Washington. He believed in seeing things firsthand and understanding how the industry really worked at ground level, which was why he was on Flight 847, wearing a hoodie and jeans with a cash-purchased ticket, and no identifying credentials visible. This was his fourth unannounced audit this year, and his track record spoke for itself. 3 airlines had overhauled their customer service protocols after his visits, 2 had fired discriminatory employees, and 1 had paid 7-figure settlements to passengers they'd mistreated. American Elite Airways was on his list because of the complaints. Not just Derek's 17 incidents, but a pattern of problems on this specific route. New York to Miami, Flight 847 had generated more discrimination complaints than any other route in the American Elite network. Passengers questioned about their real tickets. Families split up and moved to different sections without explanation. Random additional security measures that seemed to disproportionately affect travelers of color. Jerome was here to see if those complaints were justified. In the first 15 minutes of his flight, Derek Thompson had answered that question definitively. The flight itself was American Elite's flagship service, a Boeing 777-300ER, configured with only 180 seats to maximize passenger comfort. First class featured just 20 seats each, a private pod with lie-flat capability and direct aisle access. The passenger list for today's flight read like a who's who of American influence: Senator Isabella Rodriguez, returning from a climate summit in New York; tech executives heading to Miami for a conference; business leaders traveling for high-stakes meetings. And then there was Jerome, who'd specifically chosen Seat 1A because it offered the best vantage point for observing crew behavior. He'd paid cash at the counter to avoid any paper trail that might reveal his identity, dressed down to see how he'd be treated, and prepared himself mentally for whatever discrimination he might encounter. He hadn't expected it to be quite this blatant. Carmen Rodriguez, watching this confrontation unfold, was caught between her professional obligations and her moral compass. She'd worked for American Elite for 12 years, starting as a regional flight attendant and working her way up to international routes. She was proud of her career, proud of the service she provided, and deeply ashamed of what she was witnessing. Carmen had seen Derek's behavior before. The questioning of passengers who didn't look right to him. The sudden computer glitches that resulted in certain people being moved from premium seats. The way he'd talk about passengers in the galley, using coded language that everyone understood but no one officially acknowledged. She'd never spoken up before because she needed this job. She was supporting her mother back in San Antonio, helping her younger brother through college and saving for her own future. Flight attendants who caused problems for senior captains had a way of finding themselves assigned to undesirable routes or mysteriously passed over for promotions. But watching Derek humiliate Jerome Williams in front of a cabin full of passengers, seeing the way other travelers were pulling out their phones to record the incident, Carmen realized that staying silent was no longer an option. This was bigger than one flight, bigger than one captain's prejudices. This was about what kind of airline American Elite wanted to be and what kind of person she wanted to be. Brandon Miller, meanwhile, had stumbled into the story of his career. As a senior product manager at a Silicon Valley startup, Brandon understood the power of social media better than most. His live stream had started with just a few followers, but the viewer count was climbing rapidly as people shared the feed and news of the incident spread. "We're at 400 viewers now," he whispered into his phone. "This is absolutely unreal. I've never seen anything like this in person. His stream was automatically posting to TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter, and the engagement numbers were exploding. Flight 847, American elite discrimination and pilot shame were already starting to trend. The other passengers in first class were processing what they were witnessing in different ways. Senator Rodriguez, a veteran of political battles over civil rights, recognized the legal implications immediately. Jennifer Walsh, accustomed to corporate crisis management, was already thinking about the reputational damage American elite was about to face. The elderly Kim couple, survivors of discrimination themselves during their younger years, were quietly appalled by the echoes of prejudice they thought America had moved beyond. But none of them yet understood the true magnitude of what they were witnessing. None of them knew that the quiet man in seat 1A wasn't just a victim of discrimination. He was the one person in America with the authority to ensure it never happened again. That revelation was coming. Derek Thompson, standing there in his pressed uniform with his chest puffed out and his authority unchallenged, had no idea that he was about to become the most famous pilot in America for all the wrong reasons. Derek Thompson had reached his decision point. 18 years of flying had taught him that hesitation in the cockpit could be fatal, and he applied the same philosophy to command decisions in the cabin. In his mind, he'd identified a problem, a passenger who didn't belong in first class, and now he was going to solve it with the decisive authority that had made him successful. Here's what's going to happen. Derek announced, his voice carrying across the cabin with the confidence of a man accustomed to being obeyed. You're going to gather your belongings and move to economy class where you belong. I'll have Carmen find you a seat back there, and we can avoid making the situation any worse than it already is. Jerome looked up from his notebook where he'd been documenting every word. And if I refuse, Derek's smile was cold and predatory. Then you'll be removed from this aircraft for disrupting the flight. I have that authority under Federal Aviation Regulation 121.580. I can remove any passenger who poses a threat to the safety, security, or comfort of other passengers. A threat? Jerome's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the silk. I'm sitting quietly in a seat I paid for. The only person causing a disturbance in this cabin is you. You're causing a disturbance just by being here. Derek snapped, his carefully maintained composure starting to crack. Look around. Look at the other passengers. They're uncomfortable. They're questioning whether American elite maintains the standards they pay for. Senator Rodriguez couldn't stay silent any longer. Captain, I'm looking around, and the only person who seems uncomfortable is you. This gentleman has done absolutely nothing wrong. Derek turned toward the senator, recognizing her, but undeterred. Senator Rodriguez, with all due respect, you don't understand the complexities of airline operations. I have to make decisions based on the overall passenger experience. When someone clearly doesn't fit the profile of our typical first-class customer, it raises questions about security, about standards, about the integrity of our boarding process. The profile, Jerome asked quietly. What exactly is that profile? Captain Derek gestured broadly at the cabin. Professional attire, business travelers, people who understand the expectations of premium air travel. Not, he paused, searching for words that would sound less discriminatory than what he was thinking. Not people who look like they just wandered off the street. Brandon's live stream was capturing every word, and his viewer count had passed 1,000. Comments were flooding in faster than he could read them. This is straight-up racism. Call the ACLU. I'm never flying American elite again. Someone needs to stop this pilot. Carmen Rodriguez had been trying to find a way to intervene without directly challenging Derek's authority, but the situation was spiraling beyond her ability to manage diplomatically. Captain, she said, approaching cautiously. Perhaps we could discuss this privately. I'm sure we can resolve any concerns without... There's nothing to discuss privately, Carmen. Derek cut her off. This is about maintaining standards, and everyone on this aircraft needs to understand what those standards are. He turned back to Jerome, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. You paid cash for this ticket. Last-minute purchase. No history with our airline that I can verify. You're dressed like you're going to a basketball game, not traveling in the premium cabin of a major airline. In my experience, that combination raises red flags about the legitimacy of your presence here. Jerome set down his pen and looked directly at Derek. Red flags. What exactly are you implying Captain Derek had passed the point where careful language mattered? His authority had been challenged, his judgment questioned, and his control of the situation was slipping away with every passing second. In his mind, the solution was to assert dominance more forcefully to make it clear that he was in charge, and his decisions were final. I'm implying that cash payments for expensive tickets often indicate stolen credit cards or fraudulent transactions, Derek said bluntly. I'm implying that passengers who don't dress appropriately for premium service often don't understand the behavioral expectations either. I'm implying that when something doesn't look right, smell right, or feel right, it's my job as captain to investigate and take appropriate action. The cabin had gone completely silent except for the mechanical sounds of the aircraft and the quiet whisper of Brandon's live stream commentary. Even the flight crew in the back had stopped their preparations to listen to what was happening in first class. Jennifer Walsh, the business executive in seat 4A, was live streaming on her LinkedIn account, while simultaneously recording video on her phone. As someone who'd spent years in corporate diversity training, she recognized exactly what she was witnessing. This is textbook racial profiling, she whispered to her followers. This pilot is making assumptions about a passenger based purely on race and appearance. Jerome opened his notebook again and resumed writing. So, to summarize, Captain Thompson, your position is that I don't belong in first class because I'm black, because I paid cash, and because I'm not wearing a business suit. Is that an accurate assessment of your complaint? Derek's face flushed red. Don't try to make this about race. This is about standards. This is about security. This is about protecting the experience that legitimate passengers pay for legitimate passengers. Jerome repeated, writing the phrase down. As opposed to illegitimate passengers like myself, as opposed to passengers who raise questions. Derek shot back. You want to know the truth. Fine. In 18 years of flying, I've learned to spot problems before they become incidents. Cash payments, inappropriate dress, evasive behavior. These are indicators that experienced pilots recognize. I'm not being discriminatory. I'm being professional. Carmen knew she had to act. Her hands shaking slightly, she pulled out her company phone and began recording video. If Derek was determined to destroy his career and damage the airline's reputation, at least there would be an official record of what actually happened. Captain Thompson Carmen said loudly enough for her phone to pick up clearly for the record, I have verified Mr. Williams's identification and boarding pass. His payment was processed successfully by our system. He has platinum status with American Elite Airways, indicating he's a frequent and valued customer. He has made no disturbances, threatened no one, and complied with all federal regulations and airline policies. What specific regulation or policy are you citing that gives you authority to remove him from his legally purchased seat? Derek turned on Carmen with fury that made her step back. Are you questioning my authority as captain of this aircraft? I'm asking for clarification of your reasoning, Carmen replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Because right now it appears that you're discriminating against a passenger based on his race and appearance, which would violate federal law and company policy. The word discriminating hit Derek like a physical blow. In his mind, he was being professional, protective, authoritative. The idea that his actions could be interpreted as discrimination, or worse, that they actually were discrimination, was something he refused to acknowledge. I am not discriminating against anyone. Derek shouted, his voice echoing through the cabin. I am exercising my legitimate authority as pilot in command to ensure the safety and comfort of all passengers. If that passenger, he pointed at Jerome, cannot understand why his presence is problematic in this environment, then he's proving my point about not belonging here. Jerome closed his notebook again and stood up. At his full height of 6'2", with his broad shoulders and calm presence, he commanded attention in a way that made Derek unconsciously take a step back. Captain Thompson. Jerome said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that Derek had never encountered before. I want you to think very carefully about your next words. This conversation is being recorded by multiple passengers and broadcast live to thousands of people. Your airline stock price, your company's reputation, and your own career are all at stake right now. So, I'm going to ask you one simple question, and I want you to consider your answer carefully. Derek, despite himself, waited. If I were a white man wearing the exact same clothes, sitting in this exact same seat with the exact same ticket purchased in the exact same way, would we be having this conversation? The question hung in the air like a challenge that Derek couldn't ignore. Every passenger in first class was watching him, waiting for his answer. Thousands of people on social media were watching. His crew was watching. His career was balanced on the edge of his response. Derek Thompson in that moment had a choice. He could acknowledge that his treatment of Jerome was discriminatory and apologize. He could de-escalate the situation and try to salvage what remained of his professional reputation. He could recognize that he'd made a mistake and attempt to correct it. Instead, he doubled down. Yes, Derek said defiantly. Yes, we would be having this conversation because this isn't about race. This is about standards, about security, about maintaining the premium experience that American Elite Airways promises its customers. And if you can't accept that, then you're exactly the kind of passenger who doesn't belong in first class. Jerome nodded slowly, as if Derek's answer had confirmed something he'd already known. He reached into his hoodie pocket again, and Derek tensed, expecting another confrontation. What Jerome pulled out instead was his phone. "Carmen," Jerome said, never taking his eyes off Derek, "I need you to announce that this flight is delayed indefinitely pending an investigation." Carmen blinked in confusion. "Sir, I don't have authority to." "You do now," Jerome said. And there was something in his voice that made Derek's blood run cold. "Because this isn't just a customer service issue anymore, this is a federal investigation." Derek laughed, but it sounded forced and hollow. "A federal investigation. What are you going to do? Sue the airline, file a complaint with the NAACP? This is America, friend. Airlines have the right to remove disruptive passengers." Jerome looked at Derek with something that might have been pity. "Captain Thompson, you have no idea what you've just done, do you?" While Derek Thompson continued his racist tirade in the first-class cabin of Flight 847, the digital world was exploding with outrage. Brandon Miller's live stream had passed 5,000 viewers and was climbing exponentially as people shared the feed across every social media platform imaginable. "Oh my God, you guys," Brandon whispered into his phone, trying to keep his voice low while ensuring his followers could hear every word of the confrontation happening just feet away. This pilot just asked if they'd be having this conversation if the passenger were white, and the pilot said yes. He actually said yes. This is the most blatant discrimination I've ever witnessed in real life. The comments on his stream were flowing so fast they were impossible to read. "Record everything. This pilot needs to be fired immediately. What airline is this, so I never fly with them? Someone call the FBI. This is 2024, not 1950. That poor man staying so calm. White. Privilege in action. Brandon had started streaming to maybe 50 followers from his tech company, but the viewer count was now approaching 8,000. His phone was buzzing constantly with notifications as the video was being shared, reposted, and restreamed across TikTok, Instagram Stories, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Jennifer Walsh, the business executive in Seat 4A, was conducting her own digital assault on American Elite Airways' reputation. Her LinkedIn post, accompanied by a video clip, was already going viral in business circles currently witnessing the most appalling display of racism I've ever seen in corporate America. American Elite Airways Captain Derek Thompson is literally telling a black passenger he doesn't belong in first class because of his race and clothing. This is happening right now on Flight 847. How is this company training their employees? How is this behavior tolerated? Corporate racism, American elite shame, never again. The post had been shared 200 times in the first 10 minutes, with comments flooding in from executives, lawyers, and civil rights advocates. Several people had already tagged major news outlets and civil rights organizations. Senator Isabella Rodriguez was using her political platform differently, but just as effectively. Her Twitter account, followed by 800,000 people, sent out a terse message. Witnessing racial discrimination in real time on American Elite Air Flight 847. Pilot Derek Thompson is a disgrace to aviation and to basic human decency. This behavior is unacceptable in 2024. The company must act immediately. Flight 847. Discrimination, no excuses. The tweet was retweeted within seconds by other politicians, celebrities, and activists. The hashtag Flight 847 discrimination began trending immediately alongside American Elite racism and Captain Thompson's shame. Back in the cabin, Derek was oblivious to the digital hurricane forming around him. He was focused entirely on what he saw as a challenge to his authority, completely unaware that his career was being destroyed in real time by thousands of people he'd never met. "You know what your problem is," Derek said to Jerome, his voice getting louder and more aggressive. "You think you can just throw around accusations of racism and people will back down? Well, I've been flying for 18 years and I've earned my authority through experience and professionalism. I won't be intimidated by someone trying to play the victim card." Carmen Rodriguez had stopped trying to calm Derek down and was now focused on damage control. She'd sent an emergency message to the ground crew need supervisor on aircraft immediately. Captain making discriminatory statements to passenger. Situation escalating rapidly. Multiple passengers recording. Her phone buzzed with an immediate response, dispatching duty manager and American Elite executive. ETA 5 minutes, keep situation contained. Contained. Carmen almost laughed at the absurdity. This situation had passed contained about 10 minutes ago when Derek first opened his mouth. Now it was headed for viral internet fame and probably federal investigation. The other passengers in first class were processing what they were witnessing in different ways. Robert Kim, the elderly Korean-American man in seat 5A, was quietly furious. He'd faced discrimination during his younger years in the 1970s and 80s, and seeing it displayed so openly brought back painful memories. "Helen," he whispered to his wife, "are you recording this?" "Yes," she whispered back, holding up her phone. "The whole world needs to see this." The Kims had lived through an era when discrimination was more subtle, more coded, hidden behind polite language and plausible deniability. Seeing Derek Thompson's blatant racism felt like traveling backward in time to an uglier America they'd hoped their grandchildren would never experience. Meanwhile, in the economy section of the aircraft, word was spreading about what was happening in first class. Flight attendant Michael Stevens had witnessed part of the confrontation while delivering beverages and had quietly informed his colleagues and some of the passengers. Phones were coming out throughout the cabin as people tried to record audio or capture glimpses of the ongoing incident. Social media algorithms designed to amplify engaging content were working overtime. Brandon's live stream was being recommended to users across multiple platforms, and the engagement metrics were exploding. TikTok's algorithm had picked up Jennifer Walsh's video and was pushing it to millions of users. Twitter's trending topics were updating in real time as more people joined the conversation. The American Elite Airways social media team, monitoring their brand mentions from their headquarters in Dallas, were watching their notification feeds with growing horror. Brand mentions had increased by 3,000% in the past 15 minutes, and they were almost universally negative. Sarah Chen, the company's director of digital communications, was frantically trying to assess the situation. The first reports were confusing something about a discrimination incident on Flight 847, but as she watched video after video of Derek Thompson's behavior, the magnitude of the crisis became clear. "We need the CEO on a call immediately," she told her assistant. "Get legal on the line. Get HR. Get the crisis management team. And somebody find out what the hell is happening on Flight 847. But it was too late for damage control. The story had taken on a life of its own, spreading across social media faster than the airline could respond. Flight 847 was trending worldwide. American Elite racism was being picked up by news outlets, and Derek Thompson's name was becoming synonymous with airline discrimination. Back on the aircraft, Derek remained blissfully unaware of his viral fame. He was entirely focused on Jerome Williams, the quiet man who refused to be intimidated, refused to back down, and seemed utterly unimpressed by Derek's authority. "Last chance," Derek announced dramatically. "Gather your belongings and move to economy, or I'll have you removed from this aircraft by security. This is your final warning." Jerome looked at his phone, which had been buzzing with calls and messages that he'd been ignoring. One text message made him nod slightly. "We're monitoring the situation. Full support for whatever action you take." Administrator Jerome looked back up at Derek Thompson, this small-minded man who thought his uniform gave him the right to humiliate fellow human beings. Derek had no idea that he was about to become the most famous pilot in America for all the wrong reasons. He had no idea that his actions were being broadcast to tens of thousands of people and would soon be seen by millions more. Most importantly, Derek had no idea that the man he was trying to intimidate had the power to end his flying career with a single phone call. Captain Thompson Jerome said quietly, "I think it's time you learned exactly who you're talking to." The aircraft door opened with a soft pneumatic hiss, and 3 figures stepped into the jet bridge. Officer Maria Santos of the Port Authority Police was the first aboard, followed by Officer James Mitchell and American Elite Airways duty manager Rebecca Torres. They moved with the practiced efficiency of professionals who'd handled countless airport incidents, but as they entered the first-class cabin, they could immediately sense this situation was different. The cabin was electric with tension. Dozens of phones were pointed at Captain Derek Thompson, who stood in the aisle like a general surveying a battlefield. He was convinced he was winning. His uniform was still perfectly pressed, his shoulders squared, his jaw set in a line of absolute certainty. He looked like a man who believed reinforcements had arrived to validate his authority. Officer Santos, a 15-year veteran with a reputation for diffusing volatile situations, took in the scene with trained eyes. She saw Derek Thompson in his captain's uniform clearly agitated. She saw Jerome Williams in his casual clothes sitting calmly in seat 1A. She saw passengers throughout the cabin recording with their phones, a flight attendant who looked like she wanted to disappear into the galley, and an atmosphere thick with unresolved conflict. "I'm Officer Santos, Port Authority Police." She announced, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to restoring order. "We received a report of a disturbance on this aircraft. Can someone explain what's happening?" Derek stepped forward immediately, his chest puffed out with renewed confidence. "Officer Santos, I'm Captain Derek Thompson. I've identified a passenger who poses a potential security risk to this flight, and I need him removed from the aircraft." Derek gestured toward Jerome with the dismissive confidence of someone who believed his uniform automatically made his word more credible than a black man in a hoodie. This individual paid cash for an $8,000 first-class ticket, which raises immediate red flags about the source of his funds. He's dressed inappropriately for premium class, suggesting he's unfamiliar with the standards expected in this cabin. He's been evasive when questioned about his presence here, and he's attempted to intimidate me with threats of legal action when I exercised my legitimate authority as captain. Officer Santos looked from Derek to Jerome, then at the dozens of passengers still recording the interaction. Something about this situation felt wrong to her, but police protocol required her to gather information from all parties before making any judgments. Sir Officer Santos addressed Jerome politely. "Can you tell me your side of what happened here?" Jerome looked up with those calm, steady eyes that had unnerved Derek throughout the confrontation. "Officer Santos, I boarded this aircraft with a valid ticket, valid identification, and confirmed platinum status with this airline. I took my assigned seat and began reading quietly. Captain Thompson approached me and demanded I move to economy class because, in his words, people like me don't belong in first class." Derek interrupted immediately. "That's a complete mischaracterization. I never mentioned race. This is about security concerns, not discrimination," Jerome continued as if Derek hadn't spoken. "When I declined to move from a seat I'd legally purchased, Captain Thompson escalated the confrontation. He's made repeated statements suggesting that my race, my clothing, and my method of payment make me unsuitable for first-class travel. He's stated that I don't belong in this cabin and that people like me should know our place. Officer Santos felt a chill run down her spine. In her 15 years of police work, she'd learned to recognize the signs of discrimination, but she'd also learned to be careful about making accusations without clear evidence. Captain Thompson, did you make statements about this passenger's race? Absolutely not, Derek replied forcefully. This is exactly what I was talking about. This passenger is trying to turn a legitimate security concern into a racial incident. He's weaponizing political correctness to avoid accountability for his suspicious behavior. Officer Mitchell, who'd been quietly observing the interaction, stepped forward. Sir, he addressed Derek. What specific security concerns do you have about this passenger? Derek launched into his familiar litany. Cash payment for an expensive ticket, inappropriate dress for premium class evasive behavior when questioned, and attempts at intimidation when challenged. These are all red flags that any experienced pilot would recognize. Carmen Rodriguez, who'd been silently praying this nightmare would end, finally found the courage to speak. Officers, I can confirm that Mr. Williams's identification and boarding pass have been verified. His payment processed successfully through our system. He has platinum status with American Elite, indicating he's a frequent and valued customer. He's made no disturbances, violated no policies, and complied with all instructions except Captain Thompson's demand that he move to economy class. Derek turned on Carmen with renewed fury. Flight attendant Rodriguez is out of line and has been insubordinate throughout this incident. Her testimony is compromised by her refusal to support proper command authority. Officer Santos was beginning to form her own opinion about what was happening, but she maintained her professional demeanor. Are there any witnesses to these events? Brandon Miller, who'd been live-streaming the entire confrontation, spoke up immediately. Officer, I've been recording everything on livestream. Over 30,000 people have watched this entire incident. Captain Thompson has repeatedly made statements about this passenger not belonging in first class based on his appearance and race. Senator Rodriguez rose from her seat. Officer Santos, I am Senator Isabella Rodriguez. I witnessed this entire incident. Captain Thompson's behavior has been discriminatory, unprofessional, and potentially criminal. He's violated this gentleman's civil rights in front of dozens of witnesses. Derek's face went pale as he realized who he'd been performing in front of, but he doubled down anyway. Even senators can be mistaken about aviation security protocols, he said weakly. Rebecca Torres, the American Elite duty manager, had been quietly observing while simultaneously fielding frantic calls from corporate headquarters. The airline's social media team had briefed her on the viral nature of this incident, and she knew the company was facing a public relations catastrophe. Captain Thompson, Rebecca said carefully, perhaps we should discuss this situation privately. I think there may be some misunderstandings that we can resolve without further escalation. But Derek was beyond reason. The combination of challenged authority, public humiliation, and racist ideology had created a perfect storm that made rational decision-making impossible. There's nothing to discuss privately, Derek announced loudly. This passenger doesn't belong in first class, and I want him removed from my aircraft. That's my final decision as captain. Officer Santos had heard enough. In her experience, legitimate security concerns were usually accompanied by specific articulable facts. Derek's complaints were vague, contradicted by the evidence, and seemed focused entirely on Jerome's appearance and race. Captain Thompson, Officer Santos said formally, I need you to be very specific about what security threat you believe this passenger poses. What illegal activity do you suspect? What specific behavior has he exhibited that violates federal aviation regulations or airline policies? Derek realized he'd been backed into a corner. He couldn't articulate specific illegal behavior because Jerome hadn't committed any. He couldn't cite violated regulations because none had been broken. All he had were his assumptions, his prejudices, and his wounded ego. The specific threat, Derek said, his voice getting louder and more desperate, is the degradation of the premium experience that first-class passengers pay for. When someone clearly doesn't belong in that environment, it affects the comfort and security of legitimate passengers. Officer Mitchell exchanged a look with Officer Santos. They'd both recognized the discriminatory nature of Derek's statements, but they needed him to be absolutely clear about his reasoning for potential legal proceedings. "Captain Thompson," Officer Mitchell said, "when you say someone clearly doesn't belong, what criteria are you using to make that determination?" Derek looked around the cabin at the faces watching him: passengers, crew members, police officers, and an airline manager. Everyone was waiting for his answer. Everyone understood the significance of this moment. Derek Thompson, in that instant, had one final chance to step back from the precipice. He could acknowledge that he'd made a mistake, apologize for his behavior, and try to salvage what remained of his career. He could recognize that his treatment of Jerome Williams had been discriminatory and attempt to make amends. Instead, he chose to cement his legacy as one of the most notorious racists in aviation history. "Look at him," Derek said, pointing directly at Jerome. "Just look at him. Does he look like someone who legitimately belongs in an $8,000 seat? Does he dress like a first-class passenger? Does he act like someone familiar with premium air travel? Use your common sense. Some people belong in certain places and some people don't." The words hit the cabin like a physical blow. Officer Santos felt her hand move unconsciously toward her handcuffs. Officer Mitchell shook his head in disgust. Rebecca Torres put her face in her hands, knowing she'd just watched an employee destroy both his career and her company's reputation. And Jerome Williams, who'd been sitting quietly through this entire ordeal, documenting everything in his notebook, finally reached into his hoodie pocket to reveal exactly who Derek Thompson had been discriminating against. But before Jerome could speak, Carmen Rodriguez found her voice one final time. Captain Thompson. Carmen said, her voice shaking with anger and sadness. "I've worked for this airline for 12 years. I've been proud of this company and proud of my job. But what you've done today is the most shameful thing I've ever witnessed in aviation. You've disgraced your uniform, your profession, and basic human decency." Derek turned toward Carmen with the last vestiges of his authority. "Flight Attendant Rodriguez, you're fired. Effective immediately." Carmen laughed a sound with no humor in it. "You can't fire me, Captain, because in about 30 seconds you're not going to be a captain anymore." Derek's face went white. "What are you talking about?" Carmen looked towards Jerome Williams, who was now standing and reaching into his pocket. "Because you just spent the last hour discriminating against the Director of Field Operations for the Federal Aviation Administration. The man who literally has the power to revoke your license." Derek's legs nearly gave out. That's impossible." Jerome Williams pulled out his credential wallet and flipped it open, revealing the Golden Eagle badge of the Federal Aviation Administration. His voice, when he spoke, carried the quiet authority of someone who just watched a man destroy himself through his own hatred and ignorance. "Captain Derek Thompson," Jerome said formally, "you are hereby notified that your airline transport pilot license is suspended pending federal investigation into discriminatory practices and violations of passengers' civil rights. This aircraft is grounded, and you are relieved of duty effective immediately." The cabin exploded into chaos. Brandon's live stream crashed as tens of thousands of viewers tried to process what they'd just witnessed. Passengers gasped, cheered, and frantically shared the news across social media. Derek Thompson, the man who'd spent an hour asserting his authority over Jerome Williams, collapsed into a seat as the full magnitude of his situation hit him. He'd just discriminated against his own boss, and the whole world had watched him do it. The revelation that Jerome Williams was the FAA director hit social media like a digital nuclear explosion. Within seconds of his credential reveal, FAA Director Karma ATJFK and Thompson Down were trending worldwide. Brandon Miller's live stream, which had crashed under the weight of viewers, was immediately reposted, clipped, and shared across every platform imaginable. "Oh my God!" Brandon screamed into his phone as he started a new stream. "The pilot just discriminated against the head of the FAA. This is the greatest instant karma I've ever witnessed. You guys, we just watched a man destroy his entire career in real time. The viewer count on his new stream climbed from 0 to 50,000 in under 3 minutes." Comments were flooding in so fast the chat was unreadable. "This is insane. Pilot is done. Karma is real best video. Ever share everywhere." Jennifer Walsh's LinkedIn post had been shared over 2,000 times, reaching millions of business professionals worldwide. Her follow-up post announcing Jerome's identity revelation broke LinkedIn's engagement records for aviation industry content. Update: the black passenger that Captain Derek Thompson discriminated against for an hour is Jerome Williams, director of the FAA. Thompson literally spent an hour telling his own boss he doesn't belong in first class. This is the most spectacular professional suicide I've ever witnessed. Instant karma, American elite finished. The post was being shared by Fortune 500 CEOs, federal officials, civil rights leaders, and aviation professionals around the world. Major corporations were already announcing they were reviewing their travel partnerships with American Elite Airways. Senator Rodriguez's Twitter account was experiencing unprecedented engagement, as she live-tweeted the aftermath confirmed. The gentleman, American Elite Air Captain Derek Thompson, discriminated against is Jerome Williams, FAA Director of Field Operations. Thompson's pilot license has been suspended on the spot. This is what accountability looks like. Justice served at 30,000 feet. Flight 847, Justice. The tweet was retweeted by congressional colleagues, celebrities, civil rights organizations, and aviation unions. Flight 847 Justice joined the list of worldwide trending topics alongside Derek Thompson Doan and Jerome Williams. But the social media explosion was just the beginning. Major news outlets, which had initially picked up the story as viral content, were now scrambling to treat it as breaking national news. Assignment editors across the country were dispatching their top reporters to JFK Airport civil rights correspondents and aviation specialists. CNN's breaking news alert went out to millions of phones. Breaking: American Elite Airways pilot caught on viral video discriminating against passenger who turns out to be FAA director. Pilot's license suspended on the spot. MSNBC interrupted regular programming with a special report. Fox News was covering it as their lead story. BBC, Reuters, and international outlets were picking up the story as it spread globally. The American Elite Airways crisis management team was in full panic mode. CEO Richard Walsh was being briefed on the situation while simultaneously fielding calls from the board of directors, major shareholders, and corporate partners. The company's stock price, which had started declining when the first videos went viral, was now in complete freefall. "How bad is it?" Walsh asked his communications director during an emergency conference call. "Sir, it's the worst corporate PR disaster I've ever seen," Sarah Chen replied grimly. "We've got over 100 million social media impressions in the past hour, 98% negative. Our stock is down 12% in after-hours trading. Every major news outlet is covering the story. And sir, the Department of Transportation has already issued a statement saying they're launching a full investigation into our discrimination practices." Walsh closed his eyes. In his 20-year career as an airline executive, he'd never seen anything like this. What about the pilot? Thompson is finished. His license is suspended. He's facing potential federal charges, and he's probably looking at civil lawsuits from multiple parties. But, sir, the bigger problem is that Jerome Williams has authority to launch a comprehensive audit of our entire operation. This could shut us down if we don't handle it perfectly. Meanwhile, back on Flight 847, Derek Thompson was experiencing the real-time collapse of his entire life. As Jerome Williams formally suspended his pilot's license, Derek could see passengers around him refreshing their phones, watching his professional destruction unfold on social media in real time. "This can't be happening," Derek muttered, staring at Jerome's FAA credentials. "This has to be some kind of mistake." Officer Santos, who'd been documenting the entire incident for her report, looked at Derek with something approaching pity. "Sir, you need to understand the seriousness of your situation. You've been caught on video discriminating against a federal official while he was conducting an official investigation. This goes way beyond airline disciplinary action." Derek's phone started buzzing with calls. His wife, his union representative, reporters who'd somehow gotten his number. He looked at the screen in horror as he saw his name trending on Twitter alongside words like racist, fired, and discriminated. Rebecca Torres, the American elite duty manager, was trying to manage multiple crises simultaneously. Corporate headquarters was demanding a full report. The media was requesting statements, and she had 200 passengers on an aircraft that wasn't going anywhere until this situation was resolved. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rebecca announced over the intercom, "we apologize for the continued delay. Due to an ongoing investigation, this flight has been canceled. We will be arranging alternative transportation for all passengers and providing full refunds plus compensation for this incident." The announcement was met with a mixture of groans and applause. Many passengers were disappointed about the travel disruption, but others were thrilled to have witnessed aviation history. Several were already planning to turn their videos into TikTok's YouTube content and social media posts that would generate massive engagement. Carmen Rodriguez, meanwhile, was being hailed as a hero on social media. Her confrontation with Derek Thompson, her refusal to stay silent in the face of discrimination, and her support for Jerome Williams were being shared and praised across platforms. Flight attendant unions were calling her a role model. Civil rights organizations were praising her courage. Her phone was buzzing with interview requests from major news outlets, but Carmen was too emotionally overwhelmed to process what was happening. She'd stood up for what was right, but she'd also just watched a colleague, however racist, destroy his entire life in front of her. The ripple effects were spreading far beyond Flight 847. Other pilots who'd worked with Derek Thompson were being contacted by reporters asking about his past behavior. American Elite Airways employees were being interviewed about the company's culture and training practices. The aviation industry as a whole was being forced to confront questions about discrimination that many had hoped were relics of the past. Dr. Angela Foster, president of the National Association of Black Aviation Professionals, issued a statement that was being quoted in every news story about the incident. "What we witnessed today on Flight 847 is a stark reminder that discrimination in aviation is not a thing of the past. However, we also witnessed the power of technology bystander intervention and leadership to hold prejudice accountable." Jerome Williams's calm dignity in the face of outrageous discrimination and his authority to deliver immediate consequences represents the progress our community has fought for decades to achieve. The video footage from Flight 847 was being analyzed frame by legal experts, civil rights attorneys, and aviation specialists. Derek's exact words were being transcribed and dissected for evidence of discriminatory intent. Jerome's professional handling of the situation was being praised as a masterclass in leadership under pressure. But perhaps the most significant development was happening in congressional offices across Washington, D.C. Senator Rodriguez's real-time documentation of the incident had provided lawmakers with clear evidence of ongoing discrimination in commercial aviation. Bills were already being drafted to strengthen anti-discrimination enforcement, increase penalties for discriminatory behavior, and mandate better training for airline employees. As Flight 847 sat at the gate, its passengers slowly deplaning and its crew processing what they'd witnessed, the story was taking on a life of its own. Derek Thompson had become a symbol of everything wrong with unchecked authority and unexamined privilege. Jerome Williams had become a symbol of dignity, professionalism, and the power of accountability. But the story was far from over. Derek Thompson's career was finished, but the federal investigation was just beginning. American Elite Airways faced potential sanctions lawsuits and regulatory action. And the aviation industry as a whole was about to be forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about who belongs in the sky and who gets to make that decision. The incident that had started with Derek Thompson trying to remove Jerome Williams from first class had ended with Derek removing himself from aviation entirely. And the whole world had watched it happen one viral video at a time. The moment Jerome Williams flipped open his credential wallet, revealing the Golden Eagle badge of the Federal Aviation Administration, time seemed to stop in the first-class cabin of Flight 847. The silence was so complete that the only sounds were the mechanical hum of the aircraft's systems and the faint rustle of passengers shifting in their seats to get a better view. Derek Thompson's face went through a series of expressions so rapidly it was almost comical confusion, disbelief, recognition, and finally, absolute terror. His mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound, like a fish gasping for air on dry land. That's impossible. Derek finally managed to croak his voice barely above a whisper. Jerome Williams stood to his full height, and suddenly the dynamic in the cabin shifted completely. The man who had been sitting quietly enduring an hour of racist abuse now commanded the space with an authority that made Derek Thompson look small and pathetic in comparison. "My name is Jerome Williams." Jerome said, his voice carrying the quiet power of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Director of Field Operations for the Federal Aviation Administration. And Captain Derek Thompson, you have just provided me with the most comprehensive evidence of discriminatory practices I have ever witnessed in my 15 years with the FAA." The cabin erupted. Passengers gasped, applauded, and frantically worked their phones to share this incredible development. Brandon Miller's live stream, which had already crashed once under the weight of viewers, exploded again as tens of thousands of people tried to process what they were witnessing. "Oh my God, you guys!" Brandon screamed into his phone. "The passengers, the head of the FAA, this pilot just spent an hour discriminating against his own boss. This is the greatest instant karma in human history." Derek's legs buckled, and he had to grab the back of a seat to keep from falling. His entire world, 18 years of flying, his family legacy in aviation, his identity as a pilot, was crashing down around him in real time. "Sir, I didn't know." Derek stammered, the arrogance and authority completely drained from his voice. "This is a misunderstanding. I was just following security protocols." Jerome pulled out his official FAA tablet and began documenting the incident with the methodical precision of a federal investigator. "Captain Thompson, let me review what you've said to me in the past hour, all of which has been recorded by multiple witnesses and broadcast live to thousands of people." He consulted his notebook, his voice taking on the formal tone of someone reading evidence into the record. "You stated that people like me make real passengers uncomfortable. You said I don't belong in first class because of my race and appearance. You claimed that I don't fit the profile of a typical first-class passenger. You demanded that I move to economy class because I was degrading the VIP experience for white passengers." With each quoted phrase, Derek seemed to shrink further into himself. The other passengers were listening in stunned silence as Jerome methodically documented Derek's discriminatory statements. "You also stated," Jerome continued, "that people like me should know our place and that I belong exactly where people like me have always belonged, and that's not in the front of the plane. Captain Thompson, in my 15 years with the FAA, I have never heard such blatant racial discrimination from a licensed pilot." Officer Santos and Officer Mitchell were frantically taking notes, realizing they were witnessing not just an airline incident, but potential federal crimes. Rebecca Torres, the American elite duty manager, was simultaneously horrified by Derek's behavior and terrified of the implications for her company. Derek made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Mr. Williams, sir, I apologize if my words were misinterpreted. I was concerned about security, about maintaining standards. I never intended any discrimination. This is all a terrible misunderstanding." Jerome looked at Derek with an expression that mixed professional disappointment with personal sadness. "Captain Thompson, there's no misunderstanding here. Your statements were clear, your intent was obvious, and your discrimination was documented. But more importantly, this incident reveals something much larger than your personal prejudices." Jerome turned to address the entire cabin, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades fighting for justice in aviation. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst of racism. This was routine behavior from someone comfortable with discriminating against passengers. Which means this has happened before, many times, to people who didn't have the authority to fight back. Carmen Rodriguez, who'd been silently crying tears of relief and vindication, spoke up. "Mr. Williams, he has done this before. I've seen him question black passengers, Hispanic families, anyone who doesn't fit his idea of what first-class passengers should look like. The airline always covered it up, always made excuses. I should have spoken up before now. Derek turned towards Carmen with desperation in his eyes. "Carmen, you're mischaracterizing. Stop." Jerome commanded, his voice cutting through Derek's protests like a blade. "Captain Thompson, you are relieved of duty, effective immediately. Your airline transport pilot license number ATP7429831 is hereby suspended pending federal investigation. You will surrender your license, your medical certificate, and any FAA-issued credentials to Officer Santos." The formal nature of Jerome's statement hit Derek like a physical blow. This wasn't just employment discipline, this was the end of his flying career permanently and irrevocably. "You can't do this," Derek protested, his voice cracking with panic. "I have rights, I have a union, this is persecution." Jerome's expression didn't change. "Captain Thompson, I absolutely can do this, and I am doing this. Under Federal Aviation Regulation 61.15, I have the authority to immediately suspend any pilot license when the certificate holder has violated federal anti-discrimination laws or poses a risk to aviation safety. Your behavior today meets both criteria." Senator Rodriguez, who had been documenting everything on her phone, spoke up from her seat. "Captain Thompson, as chair of the Senate Aviation Subcommittee, I can assure you that this suspension is not just appropriate, it's mandatory under federal law. What you've done today isn't just morally reprehensible, it's criminal." The word criminal seemed to pierce through Derek's shock. "Criminal? I haven't committed any crimes. This is about airline policy, not criminal law." Officer Mitchell stepped forward, consulting his notes. "Actually, sir, what you've done today could constitute violations of several federal statutes. Discrimination in public accommodation, violation of civil rights under color of authority, and potentially conspiracy if this pattern of behavior was known and condoned by your employer." Rebecca Torres felt her stomach drop as she realized the potential legal liability facing American Elite Airways. This wasn't just about firing one pilot. This was about a potential federal investigation into company-wide practices. But Jerome wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone and placed a call that everyone in the cabin could hear. "Administrator Chen, this is Jerome Williams. I need to report a Level 1 discrimination incident requiring immediate federal response." "Yes, ma'am. I'm conducting an unannounced audit on American Elite Flight 847. "Yes, ma'am. I have multiple witnesses and video documentation of widespread discriminatory practices by Captain Derek Thompson. "Yes, ma'am. I've already suspended his license." Derek could hear a woman's voice on the other end of the phone, though he couldn't make out the words. Jerome listened occasionally, responding with "Yes, ma'am," or "I understand." Administrator Chen Jerome said finally, "I'm recommending a full agency investigation into American Elite Airways training, hiring, and customer service practices. Based on what I've witnessed today and statements from crew members, this appears to be a pattern of discrimination, not an isolated incident." Derek's face went completely white as he realized the scope of what was happening. This wasn't just about his individual career. Jerome was triggering a federal investigation that could shut down American Elite Airways entirely. Jerome ended the call and looked directly at Derek. "Captain Thompson, FAA Administrator Chen has authorized a complete investigation into your conduct and your airline's practices. Federal investigators will be interviewing every passenger on this flight, every crew member you've worked with, and reviewing every complaint filed against you or American Elite Airways over the past 5 years. Brandon Miller, still streaming to a massive online audience, provided running commentary. You guys, this is incredible. The FAA director just called his boss and triggered a federal investigation into the entire airline. This pilot didn't just destroy his own career, he might have brought down his whole company." The implications were staggering. Federal investigations could result in massive fines, mandatory oversight, route suspensions, or even complete shutdown of airline operations. American Elite Airways' stock price, already falling due to the viral nature of the incident, would likely collapse when news of the federal investigation broke. Carmen Rodriguez, emboldened by Jerome's support and her own moral courage, decided to tell the complete truth. "Mr. Williams, there's something else you need to know. Captain Thompson's behavior today isn't unusual. We've had training sessions where supervisors told us to be extra vigilant about passengers who don't look like they belong in premium class. We've been instructed to delay service to certain passengers while verifying their tickets multiple times. This discrimination is policy, not just one pilot's prejudice. Derek spun towards Carmen in panic. That's not true. You're lying to save yourself. But other crew members were nodding in agreement with Carmen's statements. Flight attendant Michael Stevens, who joined the group from economy class, spoke up. She's right. I've been with this airline for 8 years and we've all seen this. We've all been told to question certain passengers more than others. Jerome was taking notes on his tablet documenting every revelation. This was beyond his worst expectations. Evidence of deliberate policy-level discrimination that could result in criminal charges against airline executives. Ladies and gentlemen, Jerome announced to the cabin, what you've witnessed today is exactly why the FAA conducts unannounced compliance audits. This level of discrimination doesn't happen in isolation. It requires widespread implementation, management approval, and institutional cover-up. He looked directly at Derek Thompson, who was now slumped in a seat, staring at his hands in defeat. Captain Thompson, you're not just a racist pilot who destroyed his own career. You're evidence of a much larger problem that we're going to fix starting right now. Jerome returned to his phone to make another call. This is Director Williams. I need a full investigative team at JFK Airport immediately. We're initiating Operation Clean Sky Comprehensive Audit of American Elite Airways. Yes, all routes, all personnel, all policies. And I need media relations to prepare a statement. This is going public in a big way. Derek looked up from his hands with the expression of a man watching his entire world collapse. 16 years of perfect safety record, he said quietly. 18 years of service. My father flew for this airline. My grandfather was a war hero. This is my entire life. Jerome felt a moment of sympathy for Derek, but it was tempered by the knowledge of how many passengers had suffered discrimination at his hands. Captain Thompson, your family's legacy in aviation was honorable. Your service record shows technical competence, but none of that excuses or justifies the discrimination and racism you've displayed today. Jerome stood and addressed the entire cabin one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, what happened here today was wrong, illegal, and absolutely unacceptable. But it was also an opportunity to document discrimination, hold it accountable, and create lasting change in the aviation industry. He gestured toward the phones that had recorded everything. Your videos, your live streams, and your social media posts have created a permanent record of what discrimination looks like in 2024. That record will be used in federal investigations, civil rights lawsuits, and congressional hearings. You haven't just witnessed history, you've helped create it. The cabin erupted in applause. Passengers cheered, crew members wiped away tears, and millions of people watching online celebrated what felt like a moment of perfect justice. Derek Thompson, meanwhile, sat in his captain's uniform, which he would never wear again, contemplating the complete destruction of everything he'd worked for his entire adult life. All because he couldn't see past the color of a man's skin to recognize his basic humanity. Jerome Williams, the man Derek had tried to humiliate and remove from first class, had instead removed Derek from aviation entirely. And the whole world had watched it happen, one viral video at a time. The aftermath of Jerome Williams's identity revelation unfolded with the relentless speed of a controlled demolition. Within minutes of his phone call to FAA Administrator Chen, the quiet efficiency of federal bureaucracy transformed into urgent action that would reshape American aviation. Derek Thompson sat motionless in first class, still wearing the uniform that no longer represented his profession. His hands trembled as he slowly removed his captain's wings, his airline ID badge, and the certificates that had defined his identity for 18 years. Officer Santos documented each item as Derek surrendered them, the formal process of his professional death playing out in front of passengers still recording everything. Captain Thompson, Officer Santos, said with professional courtesy that Derek no longer deserved. You need to understand that you're facing potential federal charges. I strongly recommend you contact an attorney before speaking to anyone else about this incident. Derek's phone had been buzzing constantly calls from his union representative reporters, who'd somehow gotten his number, and family members who'd seen him trending on social media for all the wrong reasons. He let them all go to voicemail, unable to process how completely his life had changed in the span of an hour. Carmen Rodriguez was experiencing a very different kind of phone buzz. Civil rights organizations, news outlets, and labor unions were calling her a hero for standing up to Derek. Her refusal to stay silent in the face of discrimination was being shared and praised across social platforms. The Association of Flight Attendants had already issued a statement supporting her courage and calling for stronger protections for crew members who report discrimination. But Carmen wasn't thinking about her newfound fame. She was thinking about all the passengers she'd watched Derek humiliate over the years, all the times she'd stayed silent to protect her job, all the opportunities for justice that had been lost because people like her hadn't found the courage to speak up. Mr. Williams Carmen said, approaching Jerome as he continued documenting the incident, "There's something else you need to know about American Elite's policies. We have what management calls the Enhancement Protocol additional verification procedures for passengers who fit certain profiles. It's never written down, but everyone knows what it means." Jerome looked up from his tablet with the expression of an investigator who just found a crucial piece of evidence. "Carmen, I need you to document everything you know about these policies. Names, dates, specific incidents, everything. This is going to be part of a federal investigation, and your testimony could be crucial." Meanwhile, Rebecca Torres was simultaneously managing multiple crises. Corporate headquarters was demanding minute-by-minute updates. The media was requesting statements, and she had 200 passengers who needed alternative transportation. But her biggest concern was the federal investigation that Jerome Williams had just triggered. Miss Torres Jerome said, approaching the duty manager with the formal authority of his federal positions, American Elite Airways is now under investigation by the Federal Aviation Administration for potential widespread discrimination in violation of federal civil rights law. I need access to Captain Thompson's personnel file, all training materials related to customer service and passenger screening, and documentation of any discrimination complaints filed against your airline in the past 5 years. Rebecca felt her mouth go dry. She'd worked in airline management for 15 years, but she'd never faced anything like this. "Sir, I'll need to coordinate with our legal department and corporate headquarters. Some of that information may require warrants or subpoenas." Jerome's smile was polite but implacable. "Ms. Torres, as Director of Field Operations for the FAA, I have broad investigative authority under federal aviation law. I can obtain that information with or without your cooperation, but I'd recommend cooperation. It tends to go better in federal court." The threat was delivered with such calm professionalism that it took Rebecca a moment to realize she'd just been told that American Elite Airways could be facing federal criminal charges. Not just civil penalties or fines, but potential criminal prosecution for widespread discrimination. Brandon Miller, meanwhile, was experiencing the viral fame he'd never expected. His live stream of the incident had been shared millions of times across every social platform. News outlets were contacting him for interviews, and his follower count was exploding. But more importantly, his documentation of Derek's discrimination had created a permanent record that civil rights attorneys were already analyzing for potential lawsuits. "This is absolutely incredible," Brandon said to his live stream audience, which had stabilized at around 40,000 viewers. "I came on this flight thinking about business meetings, and instead I documented the most spectacular case of instant karma I've ever seen. This video is going to be studied in law schools and business schools for decades." Senator Rodriguez was using her political platform to ensure the incident had lasting impact beyond social media fame. Her real-time documentation of Derek's discrimination was already being cited in congressional offices as evidence of the need for stronger anti-discrimination enforcement in aviation. "This incident proves that discrimination in aviation is not a relic of the past," Senator Rodriguez said in a statement she posted across her social media accounts. It's happening right now to passengers who pay for services they're then denied because of their race. Congress must act to ensure this never happens again. But perhaps the most significant development was happening in American Elite Airways' corporate headquarters in Dallas. CEO Richard Walsh was facing the worst crisis in the company's history, with legal, financial, and regulatory implications that could destroy the airline entirely. "How bad is the stock drop?" Walsh asked during an emergency board call. 18% and falling, replied Chief Financial Officer Michelle Rodriguez. "Trading volume is 5 times normal. Our market cap has dropped by $3 billion in 4 hours." The financial impact was just the beginning. Major corporate clients were already canceling contracts. Frequent flyers were demanding refunds, and travel booking sites were being flooded with negative reviews. The viral nature of Derek's discrimination meant that millions of people worldwide now associated American Elite Airways with racism. "What about the federal investigation?" Walsh asked. General Counsel David Kim delivered the devastating news. "Jerome Williams has authority to audit our entire operation. Training programs, hiring practices, customer complaints, crew behavior, everything is subject to review. If they find widespread discrimination, we could face criminal charges, massive fines, and potential shutdown of operations." The board fell silent as the implications sank in. Derek Thompson's hour of racist behavior hadn't just destroyed his own career, it had potentially doomed an entire airline. Back on Flight 847, Jerome was coordinating with federal investigators while passengers slowly deplaned. Each passenger was being interviewed briefly to document their observations, creating an extensive record of Derek's discriminatory behavior that would be used in multiple legal proceedings. Dr. Robert Kim, the elderly Korean-American passenger who'd witnessed everything, approached Jerome as he prepared to leave the aircraft. "Mr. Williams, I want you to know that what you did today reminded me why I still have faith in this country. I faced discrimination when I was younger, but I never had the power to fight back the way you did. Thank you for showing that justice is possible." Jerome shook Dr. Kim's hand with genuine respect. "Sir, justice was only possible because people like you and the other passengers refused to stay silent. Your videos, your testimony, and your willingness to speak up are what will create lasting change." As passengers continued to deplane, sharing their videos and experiences on social media, the story continued to spread globally. Flight 847, Derek Thompson, racist, and Jerome Williams, hero, were trending in multiple countries. International news outlets were covering the story as an example of both America's ongoing struggle with racism and its capacity for accountability. Derek Thompson, escorted off the aircraft by Port Authority officers, faced a gauntlet of cameras and reporters who'd rushed to JFK Airport. His walk of shame through the terminal was being broadcast live on multiple news channels, cementing his place in history as one of aviation's most notorious figures. Captain Thompson, reporters shouted as he was led away. "Do you regret your statements? Will you apologize to Mr. Williams? What do you say to people calling you a racist?" Derek said nothing. His head down, his career over his reputation destroyed by his own words, captured on video and broadcast to millions. The man who'd started the day as a confident pilot with 18 years of experience was ending it as a symbol of everything wrong with unchecked prejudice and institutional racism. Jerome Williams, meanwhile, was just getting started. The investigation he'd triggered would examine not just Derek Thompson's behavior, but the entire structure that had enabled and protected discriminatory practices for years. Real change was coming to American aviation, and it was coming fast. The incident that had started with Derek trying to remove Jerome from first class had ended with Derek removing himself from aviation entirely. But more importantly, it had created an opportunity for fundamental reform that would benefit every passenger who followed. 3 weeks after Flight 847 was grounded at JFK Airport, Jerome Williams stood in the main auditorium of the Federal Aviation Administration headquarters in Washington, D.C. The room was packed beyond capacity with pilots, airline executives, union representatives, and civil rights advocates. Media from around the world had requested credentials, and the event was being live-streamed to ensure transparency in what Jerome was calling the new era of aviation accountability. Behind Jerome, a massive screen displayed the findings of the most comprehensive discrimination audit in aviation history. Operation Clean Sky had examined American Elite Airways from top to bottom, but its implications reached far beyond a single airline. Ladies and gentlemen, Jerome began, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made Derek Thompson's racism so shocking in comparison. What happened on Flight 847 wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of deep-rooted problems that have plagued commercial aviation for decades. Jerome clicked a remote, and the screen displayed statistics that made the audience gasp. In the past 5 years alone, the FAA has received over 12,000 complaints about discrimination in commercial aviation. Passengers questioned about their legitimacy based on race. Families separated because they didn't look like they belonged in premium class. Individuals subjected to additional security screening based solely on appearance. The numbers were staggering, but what made them worse was the follow-up statistic Jerome displayed next. Of those 12,000 complaints, fewer than 200 resulted in any action by airlines. The rest were dismissed as misunderstandings or policy compliance or simply ignored entirely. Carmen Rodriguez, sitting in the front row as a key witness, felt tears forming as she remembered all the passengers she'd watched suffer discrimination while she stayed silent. Her testimony had been crucial in documenting American Elite's widespread discrimination, and she'd become a powerful advocate for crew members who witnessed discrimination to speak up. But Flight 847 changed everything, Jerome continued. Not just because it was recorded and broadcast to millions of people, but because it demonstrated that accountability is possible when we have the courage to demand it. Jerome clicked again, and the screen displayed what he called the Thompson Protocol, named after Derek Thompson, not as an honor, but as a permanent reminder of what happens when prejudice meets authority. Effective immediately, every commercial airline operating in United States airspace will implement new anti-discrimination protocols, Jerome announced. These aren't suggestions. These aren't recommendations. These are federal requirements backed by the full authority of the FAA. The first requirement drew murmurs of approval from civil rights advocates in the audience. All airline personnel, pilots, flight attendants, gate agents, customer service representatives will undergo mandatory bias recognition training every 6 months. This training will include real-world scenarios, video examples, and clear consequences for discriminatory behavior. Jerome had worked with psychologists and civil rights experts to develop training that went beyond simple sensitivity sessions. The new protocols required employees to confront their own biases, understand how discrimination manifested in aviation, and learn specific intervention techniques for stopping discriminatory behavior by colleagues. Second, Jerome continued, "We're implementing real-time discrimination reporting on every aircraft. Passengers and crew members will have direct access to federal investigators through secure applications that document incidents as they happen with automatic notification to FAA enforcement teams." The technology was revolutionary QR codes in every seat back that connected passengers directly to federal investigators, encrypted recording capabilities that preserved evidence automatically, and tracking that identified patterns of discriminatory behavior across multiple flights and crew members. Third, we're establishing independent review boards for all discrimination complaints, with members drawn from civil rights organizations, passenger advocacy groups, and community leaders. Airlines will no longer investigate themselves. This requirement addressed one of the most persistent problems in aviation discrimination: the tendency of airlines to minimize, dismiss, or cover up incidents to protect their reputation and avoid liability. The new independent review boards would have authority to conduct their own investigations, impose penalties, and recommend federal enforcement action. Senator Rodriguez, who'd become a key advocate for aviation reform since Flight 847, spoke from the audience. Director Williams: "How will these new protocols prevent another Derek Thompson from discriminating against passengers?" Jerome's answer was comprehensive and uncompromising. Senator, the Thompson Protocol creates multiple layers of accountability that make discrimination both immediately detectable and professionally fatal. First, the bias training makes discriminatory behavior harder to rationalize or excuse. Second, the real-time reporting means discrimination can't be hidden or covered up. Third, the independent review process ensures complaints are taken seriously and investigated thoroughly. But Jerome wasn't finished. Most importantly, we're creating personal liability for discriminatory behavior. Pilots, flight attendants, and airline managers who engage in discrimination will face individual federal charges, not just employment consequences. Captain Thompson lost his license, but under the new protocols, he would also face criminal prosecution and civil liability. The audience erupted in applause, but Jerome raised his hand for quiet. However, these protocols only work if people use them. What made Flight 847 different wasn't just my authority as FAA director. It was the courage of passengers like Brandon Miller, Senator Rodriguez, and Dr. Kim to document what they witnessed and refuse to stay silent. Jerome gestured towards Carmen Rodriguez. It was flight attendant Carmen Rodriguez's decision to speak the truth instead of protecting a discriminatory structure. Carmen has become our lead trainer for the new bias recognition programs, helping airline employees understand that staying silent in the face of discrimination isn't neutral, it's complicit. Carmen stood to acknowledge the applause, but Jerome could see the weight of years of witnessed discrimination in her eyes. Her transformation from silent bystander to powerful advocate represented exactly the kind of cultural change the Thompson Protocol was designed to create. The technology and training are crucial, Jerome continued, but lasting change requires something more fundamental, a recognition that aviation belongs to everyone. When the Wright brothers first took flight, they weren't thinking about who would be allowed in first class or economy. They were thinking about the human dream of flight itself. Jerome's voice took on the inspirational tone that had made him a powerful leader throughout his career. Every passenger who boards an aircraft, regardless of race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, or economic status, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. Not because it's good for business or legally required, but because it's fundamentally right. The screen behind Jerome displayed photos from Flight 847 Derek Thompson's racist confrontation passengers recording the incident. Jerome revealing his credentials and the aftermath that had triggered nationwide reform. But the final image was different. A photo of diverse passengers boarding an American Elite Airways flight the previous week, smiling and relaxed, confident they would be treated fairly. American Elite Airways has become the first airline to fully implement the Thompson Protocol, Jerome announced. Their discrimination complaints have dropped to zero. Their customer satisfaction ratings have reached all-time highs. Their employees report feeling more confident and supported in providing excellent service to all passengers. The transformation hadn't been easy for American Elite. The airline had faced massive financial losses, executive resignations, and federal oversight. But under new leadership committed to genuine equality, they'd become a model for the industry. The Thompson Protocol launches nationwide in 60 days, Jerome concluded. Every airline will comply or they'll lose their operating certificates. Every employee will receive training or they'll lose their jobs. Every passenger will have recourse or we'll shut down operations until they do. As the audience rose in sustained applause, Jerome felt the satisfaction of turning a moment of ugliness into lasting reform. Derek Thompson's discrimination had been horrific, but it had created an opportunity to address problems that had been ignored for too long. The man who'd tried to remove Jerome from first class because of his race had inadvertently triggered the most comprehensive anti-discrimination reform in aviation history. Sometimes, Jerome reflected, justice came not despite our enemies but because of them. 6 months after Flight 847 became the most famous grounded aircraft in aviation history, Jerome Williams stood at Arlington National Cemetery beside the weathered granite headstone of Master Sergeant William Wings Williams. The morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of blue sky that made Jerome understand why his grandfather had fallen in love with aviation, despite being denied the chance to fly commercially. "We did it," Granddad Jerome said quietly, placing a small model airplane beside the headstone, the same type of P-51 Mustang that Wings had maintained for the Tuskegee Airmen, but never got to fly for civilian airlines. "The sky belongs to everyone now." Jerome pulled out his phone and showed the headstone a video that had gone viral the week before. It showed a young black girl, maybe 8 years old, walking confidently onto an American Elite Airways flight with her family. The flight attendant, trained under the Thompson Protocol, greeted her with genuine warmth and showed her to her first-class seat. The girl's smile was radiant as she looked out the window, dreaming perhaps of becoming a pilot herself. 63 complaints dropped to 0 across the industry. Jerome continued his one-sided conversation with his grandfather's memory. Not because discrimination disappeared overnight, but because the consequences became real and immediate. Turns out, when people know they'll be held accountable, they find ways to treat others with basic human decency. The transformation had been remarkable. Airlines that had previously dismissed discrimination complaints as misunderstandings were now competing to demonstrate their commitment to equality. Pilot training programs were actively recruiting diverse candidates. Flight attendant unions were celebrating the protection and empowerment that came with mandatory bias training and clear reporting protocols. But perhaps, most importantly, passengers were flying with confidence that they'd be treated fairly regardless of their race, religion, or appearance. The fear and anxiety that many travelers of color had experienced for decades was gradually being replaced by the assurance that discrimination would be swiftly punished rather than quietly tolerated. Jerome's phone buzzed with a text from Carmen Rodriguez, who'd become a close friend and powerful advocate for aviation equality. The message included a photo from her latest training session, a diverse group of airline employees learning how to recognize and interrupt discriminatory behavior. Carmen's transformation from silent bystander to vocal champion had inspired thousands of aviation workers to speak up when they witnessed unfairness. "Training 200 more crew members today," Carmen's text read. "Every session I tell them about Flight 847 and how staying silent makes you part of the problem. Your courage gave all of us permission to find our own." Jerome smiled as he remembered Carmen's terrified face during Derek Thompson's racist tirade and how she'd eventually found the strength to speak truth to authority. Her story had become as important as his own, in demonstrating that ordinary people could create extraordinary change when they chose justice over comfort. The legacy of Flight 847 extended far beyond aviation. The incident had sparked nationwide conversations about discrimination in transportation hospitality and corporate America generally. Business schools were teaching case studies about Derek Thompson's spectacular professional suicide and Jerome Williams's calm demonstration of authentic leadership under pressure. High schools were showing students the videos to discuss bystander responsibility and the power of speaking up against injustice. Derek Thompson himself had become an unlikely catalyst for positive change, though not in any way he'd intended. After losing his pilot's license, his house, his marriage, and most of his savings to legal fees and civil settlements, Derek had been forced to confront the racist beliefs that had destroyed his life. Jerome had heard through aviation industry contacts that Derek was now working as a baggage handler at a small regional airport, earning minimum wage while trying to rebuild his life. There were reports that he'd undergone counseling and expressed genuine remorse for his behavior, though Jerome wasn't sure whether the change was authentic or simply practical. "I hope he finds peace," Jerome told his grandfather's headstone. "Hate is a poison that destroys the person carrying it more than anyone else. Maybe losing everything will help him find his humanity." Jerome's phone rang Administrator Chen, calling with updates about the Thompson Protocol's implementation nationwide. The results were exceeding everyone's expectations. Discrimination complaints had dropped 89% across all airlines. Customer satisfaction ratings were at historic highs. Employee morale surveys showed that workers felt more confident and supported when they had clear guidelines about treating passengers fairly. The "The President wants to present you with the Presidential Medal of Freedom," Administrator Chen said after delivering the positive statistics. "Your handling of Flight 847 and the subsequent reforms have made commercial aviation a model for other industries." Jerome felt humbled by the recognition, but he knew the real heroes were the passengers who'd refused to stay silent, and the crew members who'd found courage to speak up. "Administrator Chen, I'd be honored to accept, but only if Carmen Rodriguez and the other Flight 847 witnesses are recognized as well." Change only happened because ordinary people chose to do extraordinary things. As Jerome prepared to leave the cemetery, he noticed another visitor approaching his grandfather's headstone. An elderly black man wearing a Korean War veteran's cap walked slowly toward the grave carrying flowers. "Excuse me," the man said, "are you related to Wings Williams?" His grandson Jerome replied. Jerome Williams. The man's face lit up with recognition. "You're the FAA director." "The one from that airplane incident." He extended his weathered hand. "I'm Thomas Carter. I served with your grandfather in Korea. He saved my life during a Chinese artillery attack, pulled me out of a burning aircraft." Jerome shook Thomas's hand, feeling the connection to family history and military service that had shaped his grandfather's character. He never talked much about the war, but he always said his real regret was not getting to fly commercially after serving his country. Thomas nodded sadly. "Wings was the best pilot I ever knew, but the airlines wouldn't give him a chance. Said passengers wouldn't feel safe with a colored pilot." Thomas paused, looking at Jerome with pride and wonder. "But look at you now, running the whole aviation operation, making sure nobody gets treated the way he was." Jerome felt tears forming as he realized that his grandfather's dreams had been deferred, but not destroyed. They'd been passed down through generations until someone had the authority and opportunity to make them real for others. "Mr. Carter, would you like to see something that would make Granddad proud?" Jerome pulled out his tablet and showed Thomas videos from airports across America, diverse pilots boarding aircraft, families of all races being welcomed warmly in premium cabins, children of color looking up at airplanes with dreams of flying rather than fear of discrimination. Thomas watched the videos with tears streaming down his face. Wings would have loved to see this. All those years he maintained other people's planes, dreaming of the day when flying would be fair for everyone. As Jerome drove away from Arlington Cemetery, he reflected on the journey from that horrible hour on Flight 847 to this moment of transformation. Derek Thompson's racism had been painful and infuriating, but it had created an opportunity to address problems that had been hidden for too long. The sky that had once been divided by prejudice and limited by discrimination was now truly open to everyone. Children could board airplanes without their parents worrying about humiliation. Travelers could focus on their journeys rather than preparing for possible mistreatment. Aviation workers could take pride in serving all passengers with dignity and respect. Most importantly, the next generation was growing up in a world where Derek Thompson's behavior was not just morally wrong, but immediately punished. They would inherit an aviation operation that valued human dignity over arbitrary prejudice, where authority was exercised with justice rather than bias. Jerome Williams, the man Derek Thompson had tried to remove from first class, had instead removed discrimination from American aviation. The quiet dignity he'd shown under pressure had sparked nationwide reform that would protect millions of future passengers from the humiliation he'd endured. The sky belonged to everyone now, exactly as it should have from the very beginning. If you've ever faced discrimination or witnessed injustice and wondered whether speaking up would make a difference, let this story remind you that your voice matters. Change happens when ordinary people choose courage over comfort, when bystanders become advocates, and when those with authority use it to protect rather than oppress. The next time you see someone being treated unfairly because of their race, their religion, their appearance, or any other characteristic, remember Flight 847 and ask yourself, what would Jerome Williams do? What would Carmen Rodriguez do? What would you do if you knew your actions could create lasting change for millions of people? Justice begins with a single voice refusing to stay silent. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, if it inspired you to stand up for what's right, then please hit that like button and share this video with everyone you know. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about courage, accountability, and the power of standing up for justice. Your share could reach someone who needs to hear this message today. Your like helps us continue telling these important stories. And your subscription ensures you'll never miss another tale of justice served and dignity restored. Because when we share these stories, when we celebrate these moments of accountability, we're not just entertaining ourselves, we're changing the world one story at a time. Thank you for watching, and remember, the next hero in one of these stories could be you.